Hi, Maggie. This is Edward D. Thanks for sharing your personal statement with me today. So, in your comments, you asked me to focus on a couple of things. Specifically, you were interested in being concise and whether or not you captured your audience's attention, whether or not it was boring or if that you needed to edit some things out with it. The essay is only 500 words, so sometimes with personal statements that can be a challenge. So so when I was preparing my feedback for you, I kind of kept those three things in mind. And I came up with kind of three things that I think you might want to think about. First of all, I would think about narrowing your story. We'll go into each of the details in just a moment. Second, I would also think of this as an argument as well. And then finally, generalizations. I think the first one is this idea of thinking about a personal statement as an argument. Imagine that a lot of times I think about it this scenario. So you've sent your application into a college. It's all they have is your CV and the personal statement, and there's someone sitting in the dark trying to, figure out which one they're going to keep. So they're reading it very quickly. So it needs to be a fairly clear and a fairly concise argument for why you're the best candidate as well. So one of the things that you want to think about is this idea that when you're saying, it's like, I believe these experiences were tailor-made for me to endure to better understand my nursing visits to bring health to the sick, hope to the broken, and strength to the impaired right there. So the nice thing I'd like about this is that it does end up seeming like a thesis, like an argument right there. But one of the things that you do want to make sure of is that the body of the paper ends up supporting these kind of argument points for why you end up being the best candidate as well. One of the other things that I would kind of consider, though, is this idea of narrowing your story. Now, so you asked me to think about where you could edit. And one of the things, the first thing I noticed is that you seem to be telling three stories throughout the document. So you have your sister with Crohn's disease. You then have your father regaining his strength after his stent operation. And then further on, you then have your husband here at the very end who is involved in heart surgery as well. So in a 500-word essay, that's a lot of things going on. I think my advice would be to think about how you could narrow this down to one of these stories. Of the three stories, I think the one that seemed the most impactful to me is this one right here about your about your husband. It's the most immediate. I imagine that when you're kind of thinking back into the past and you're trying to remember experiences about your father or your sister, that may not be as immediately able to draw forth from that. But this one, I suspect, will be fairly fresh in your mind right there. And I think this goes into, so it may end up being, then you look at the story and say, so I was able to see how nurses were able to help my husband in the situation. Because I think that's where it is that you need to, the question asked about why, what influenced your decision to go into the nursing career. So maybe a single story about your husband and seeing the situation and how nurses were able to help him at that time might make for a very compelling argument as well. The other thing you want to be careful about in personal statements are these ideas of kind of generalities. So that in this section right here, you're talking about the In Touch Crisis hotline right here. And you say specifically, there I took confidential calls that were treated in an objective, non-judgmental fashion right there. The challenge about that right there is that the reader doesn't have any way of verifying that this is true, so that it ends up being just kind of a statement that you're making. It's just kind of a generalization. We assume that that you would think that you were doing it in an objective, non-judgmental fashion, but that may not be the case. I was wondering if somehow or another you could switch this. So what would you want to end up doing to support this would end up being something along the lines where you said, my supervisors were quick to point out that that my calls were objective and non-judgmental in fashion. So that way we have an outside source being the person who ends up making these calls about whether or not something is objective or is not objective. The other thing that you may want to consider when you're end up doing this as well is think about some other sources as well. So a really good one is the Purdue Online Writing Lab right here, and it has a lot of different kind of information about writing personal statements, about different examples. It does have some examples as well. In here, and what I would suggest doing is you might want to go over and read over because I think there's a lot of good advice in here. But I think they're kind of tying into your questions. One of them, telling a story. So one of the things that you want to make this compelling, and you are concerned about it not being boring. And a good way of doing that is making stories. The other one, which ties back to mine, is being specific. So as many places as you can be specific and kind of narrow that down, I think will be beneficial. And then also the idea of not including too many subjects as well, keeping a fairly narrow focus as well. All right, I hope this has been beneficial, and good luck with the scholarship.